For those of you who know me, my name is Devin Persad. I am the current president of SABA Toronto. I've had the pleasure of knowing our guest speaker, Tawfiq, for a few years now. Well, a couple of years, I guess I should say. And it's been an amazing experience, and I'm going to let him recount his story and how he got here. But before we do that, I just want to thank all of you for coming because I know there was this winter Armageddon that we had yesterday. We didn't have to call in the Army this time, but we did manage to have quite a few people missing from the office. So if you're here in person, thank you very much. Those of you listening at home virtually, thank you also for attending. Sorry we're a bit late getting started, but like I mentioned before, we had some late arrivals, so hopefully we'll keep you engaged for the whole period. Right after this, we're going to have some cocktails in the atrium there, so please make sure that you stick around for that and get to meet and mingle with lots of different SABA members, and we'll have time for questions at the end as well. So before I get started, there is a special guest that I wanted to introduce who's going to give us some opening remarks, and that is Dean Mary Condon. Mary was appointed the Dean of Osgoode Hall Law on July 1st, 2019, and she was also formerly served as the Commissioner and board member for the OSC. So she's well-versed in securities law and probably lots of public corruption cases. I don't know if anything touched on the level of the WE scandal, but we'll get to that. She's an author in her own right, having authored probably many of the securities law textbooks that you read. I don't know if the reading is quite as dense, but it's, I'm sure the people who know it love it. So without any further ado, please, let's have a hand for Dean Condon.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks very much to Devin for that far too warm welcome. As he said, my name is Mary Condon, and I currently have the privilege of being the Dean of Osgoode Hall Law School. So a number of you in the audience will know that when we have public events at York University, we begin with a land acknowledgement, which is a very important aspect of our reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada. So I'm going to begin with that acknowledgement, which is that York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area that's now known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It's now home to many Indigenous people. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So let me add my voice of welcome to Devin's. I'm really delighted that you are all here, both in person and virtually. And I just really want to say a few words of thanks to some very important actors this evening. So first of all, let me thank the South Asian Bar Association for reaching out to Osgoode Professional Development and arranging this collaborative venture of this wonderful fireside chat that we're all going to be listening to this evening. So we at Osgoode, as you may know, are really proud of Osgoode Professional Development. It's a way in which we keep our close connections to the legal profession, to all of our alumni, and the programming that Osgoode Professional Development does really helps us keep on the cutting edge of legal education and lifelong learning within the legal profession. So we're really thrilled to have the opportunity to host the South Asian Bar Association for this event. And we thank them, as I say, for choosing Osgoode Professional Development to host this event. So let me say that when people ask me, what do you like about being the Dean of Osgoode Hall Law School? It is often the case that I say that one of the greatest pleasures of being the Dean of Osgoode is the opportunity to follow the careers and to connect with our wonderful alumni. we really do have some very distinguished, creative, exciting alumni at Osgoode Hall Law School. They engage in a wide variety of activities once they leave Osgoode. And it's all over the map. They literally, geographically, and creatively and intellectually as well. They engage in all kinds of sophisticated commercial transactions. They do challenging litigation. They promote and advance the cause of access to justice. And at the bottom of everything, and importantly, they promote and maintain the rule of law in our society and, where possible, around the world. And so I think that you can tell that our speaker this evening exemplifies many of those activities as an alum of Osgoode. And so for that reason, I'm absolutely delighted that he's been able to join us this evening to talk about not just the interesting and suspenseful book that he has written about the we issue, but also more generally about his career, which I know many of you will have read about. He is a specialist in securities and capital markets enforcement, as Devin mentioned, a subject very close to my heart, but he also, in his other activities, engages in some very important access to justice activities that ensure that marginalized members of our community really do have the opportunity to have legal representation and have their issues addressed appropriately. So with great thanks to him for coming all the way from New York City to speak to us this evening, I welcome him and look forward to the conversation this evening. Thank you so much.
Any further ado, I'll just turn this off so we don't get feedback. Yes, so without any further ado, please welcome Tawfiq Rangwala.
Turn this on.
There we go.
Hello? Okay.
Can you hear me?
It works.
So Tawfiq, thank you so much for joining us here in Toronto. You did manage to get here safely. I have to say that, myself being an interloper, because I'm not an Osgoode alumni, I'm from the University of Ottawa. Boo.
No one's perfect.
No one's perfect, yeah. I do humbly thank Osgoode for welcoming us. This building was probably built after you graduated, I assume, and you probably never had any PD classes, but do you have any fair memories of your time at Osgoode and a young man on the town like yourself, how that would have looked?
Oh, I barely remember what it's like to be a young man on the town, but I do have fond memories of Osgoode, and I should just say thank you to Osgoode. I do think that someone will disabuse me of it, but I actually do think this building was around when I was in Osgoode. I think it's been around for a long time, and I remember coming to events here, including I think some on-campus interviews. Dean Condon will remind me, where it was used for that purpose in those days. So I have memories of this place. I have fond memories of Osgoode. It reminds me of being young, and I was laughing because I was talking to Dean Condon earlier, and I recognized that when I was in law school, for example, I was naive about the things I was going to do in the future. I fancied myself perhaps not ready to take complicated securities law courses by Dean Condon, and so I don't think I ever expected that I'd spend 20 years then becoming a securities enforcement lawyer. But no, I miss Osgoode and everything about it, so it's really awesome to be here. And thanks also to SABA, which is a big part of my life and the life of my wife, who's here as well tonight, Rippy, and so many others in the room. So.
Yes, and thank you to all of the SABA supporters who are here tonight as well, and salsa chapters. You make a big difference in building our pipeline for the future. So you set this stage for me. You are a young graduate from Osgoode. You decide, okay, I'm taking my talents to New York, as LeBron James once did to Miami. Was it as much
just like
of
that? Just like that.
Was it as much of a debating process that he made, or was it simply the money? And you can be straightforward with us. We won't judge.
The question is designed to say, why did you sell out? Is what no. Well, as many people, and I think they're probably, I can't see who's on the Zoom, but I feel you. And I know some people from the US are there. For me, I moved, I'm a very proud Canadian. One of the great parts of this book, and one of the strange silver linings of the COVID pandemic, is that I've been able to spend more time in Canada and re-engage with all things Canadian, which I hadn't been able to do for a long time. But I moved to New York because it was a cool, exciting opportunity when I was a young student at the time. And I fell in love with practice, not so much just because of New York, but also because of where I work, which is Milbank, my law firm, where I've just found it's always been both a really fun and exciting place to practice law, but also a platform that has allowed me to do the things I want to do in the world and be the person I want to be. And that is reflected in diversity-related matters. It's reflected in the pro bono work I do, and it's reflected in the opportunity to write this book, which I managed to do while working at the firm. And so that's really what's kept me in New York. That's really what brought me to New York. But I always love being home too, and I feel very proud Torontonian and Canadian these days.
It seems like we had also a ton of people who were going back and forth from some of the larger Bay Street firms here going to New York, coming back to Toronto, and vice versa. What do you feel is the biggest difference between New York and Toronto? Is there? And I guess you never practiced law here?
Traffic and snow.
Those are the similarities, or
no? Those are differences. I know in Toronto it feels like there's a lot of traffic, but it's not true.
It's not true.
No, but sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I was just reflecting on the fact that even though it is a bit of a distance and the process is a bit more different, we are seeing a lot more Canadians who are going to New York to start their practice there. I don't know if that's going to continue because it happened a lot during the pandemic, especially when people were able to work from home. It's probably going to dissipate, I assume, in the next couple of years, touch wood. But before we get to the substance of your book, I think everyone here at one time or another has thought about writing a book in some capacity or not. I myself thought I could be a mystery novelist, and I got to like page 2 and I was like, okay, this is very hard. So I scrapped that idea, decided to go to law school. But then when I went to law school, and then when I became actually a lawyer, like your day is just taken up with someone, especially like you, whose practice is so varied and vibrant, and you've got to travel a lot. Where on earth did you find time to write a book, and what made you want to do this? It's a huge undertaking.
You're absolutely right. It is the hardest thing I've ever done. And so I still don't really know where I found the time, but you just sort of fit it in. I think I was, I'll say a couple things about it. I mean, first, I was supported. First, to be able to do something like this, I was supported by a lot of different people, right? That starts with my family, my wife and my son, Nadeem, who are also here, who basically filled in all the gaps and allowed me to work on it from midnight to 4 a.m. a lot of days. I'm also joined here, I'm really delighted and honored that the head of Optimum Publishing, Dean Baxendale, is here tonight and joining us. And he was obviously provided huge support, not just in terms of encouragement for the book, but in terms of the actual resources that I used to write the book, including an amazing editor, research assistants. So I had to draw upon lots of different pools of talent. I get to put my name on the book, but if you read the acknowledgments, there's dozens of people who are huge contributors to it. In terms of, so I wanted to acknowledge those people, but beyond that, it was really an interesting ordeal because I must say I had a lot of hubris. I thought when you write a book, it would be easy for me to do. I knew it would be like, complicated, difficult, take time, but I write for a living. I think a lot of us do that. I've learned to be clear and concise, and I fancy myself a decent, if not really good writer. But writing a book was nothing like that. It was a real challenge, and for lawyers in the room or aspiring lawyers who are students, it's just very interesting because when you write a legal brief or a factum, as we'd say here, a lot of times you need to be clear, concise, you need to be persuasive, and all those things are true when you're writing a book. But when you're doing legal writing, you don't have things like needing to have suspense at the end of every section, right? Or judges are paid to read what you write. And you don't want to be boring, But no one would say, well, you're saying it all up front and that's a total mistake. They're going to lose interest. Or there's no fear that, the judge just stops reading at page 3 and awards the case to the other side. Whereas here, my editor would always say things like, you got to get rid of like 5 pages right now because it's just gotten dull. And I would say, but that's a really important point. It's really, thoughtful and logical, and I need to make it. And they said, but no one's going to read it. They're all going to stop. And that was the real trick of it. The rhythm was hard to find, of this need to have every chapter end with like a bit of suspense to both, educate, make the points you want to make, and as Dean will explain better than anybody, and entertain at the same time, so that people are willing to engage with the material. It was, I'm not sure I've even been successful at it, but that was the mission, and it was hard.
Yeah, and you can take that, see that it's really evident it's really evident when you read, chapter by chapter, how you get hooked into the next one. But before we get into the actual substance, I think there's a few people here who might not actually know, and especially those who are listening on Zoom and not from Canada, this big scandal that we had involving the weed charity that was in the midst of the heavy days of the pandemic. Do you mind just taking a few minutes and kind of explaining, why that was such a momentous occasion for not only our not-for-profit sector, but also, Canadian government as a whole?
Sure. So the story of the weed charity scandal, I'm suspecting, well, actually, I'm going to do this, even though the people on Zoom can't participate. How many people in this room have heard of the weed charity scandal? Okay, so that's pretty uniform. How many people feel in this room like they really know what the weed charity scandal is about? Okay, many, for those not on Zoom, many fewer hands. So in essence, that's the gap I was trying to close with this book, and in many ways, that's why I wrote it. So for those who don't know, although most in this room do, but I'll recap it, the so-called weed charity scandal, and that's why it's so called in the banner, because I think scandal is a misnomer, at least in terms of who was scandalized and who did the scandalizing. The weed charity scandal was really about this. In the early days of the COVID pandemic, in April 2020, the Liberal government, led by Justin Trudeau, came up with a program called the Canada Student Service Grant. And the idea behind the Canada Student Service Grant was that it would basically provide grant money to young people, mostly university-bound young people, who weren't going to be able to get jobs in the first summer of the pandemic. It would provide grants of up to $5,000 if they volunteered for nonprofits. And the idea was help young people make ends meet in a difficult time in the middle of the pandemic and help the struggling nonprofit sector at the same time. And it seemed like a very sensible idea. I think a key disclosure that I make in the book, and that's important, is I was on the board of We Charity at the time. And so this is sort of an insider's perspective. That's why it's called Inside the Attack, because it is, I wear my bias on my sleeve. I was there for it, and I like to say I had a front row seat and a backstage pass to what eventually became a train wreck. But this was this really celebrated thing, this grant, because it was something that would really help. And what happened is the government appointed We Charity to administer this program. Now, for those who don't know We Charity was formerly known as Free the Children, was one of the largest charities in the country focused on youth empowerment and also international development work. And its raison d'etre was essentially connecting young people with volunteering opportunities. Yeah. So when it came to a grant program that was trying to connect young people to volunteering opportunities, it made perfect sense for the government to ask We Charity to administer that program. That's what happened. We Charity started to do it. But within days, opposition politicians on all sides of the aisle, across the political spectrum, basically cried foul and suggested that the awarding of this program to We Charity was the product of cronyism, pointing to ties to the charity by Justin Trudeau, other members of the Liberal government, including the former finance minister, and also the fact that Justin Trudeau's Prime Minister's wife and mother had been advocates with the charity for mental health causes. And so the suggestion was the Trudeau government had just given this program to its friends. And the story just took off like wildfire, primarily because it was a vehicle for the parties to try and really get to Trudeau at a time where I think he was riding a little bit high in the polls, and people were at that time very, I think, positive generally about how the pandemic was being handled. And but like all things in life, and we see that every day in the news, things have a way of spiraling where We Charity somehow became the centerpiece in this whole scandal. Even though it was really about the Liberal government scandal, the questions that should have been asked were, did the Liberal government do what it was supposed to do in terms of observing conflict of interest rules, policing itself, managing conflicts of interest, observing proper procurement policies. But instead, it quickly had a name, and it became the We Charity scandal.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the consequence of that was sort of a media outcry that became fixated on We Charity, a lot of extreme political sound bites, mostly through Twitter, and mostly through social media, that really took things out of context and labeled We Charity a bad actor. And I was sitting on the board through that whole thing, and it was just really painful to watch because it became pretty impossible to fight back. And the ultimate, to end this narrative, the ultimate outcome is that We Charity closed its doors in Canada. And for me, that was just a very painful part of my own experience. It was very painful for me in part because it was COVID. I was spending a lot more time in Canada than I ever had in decades, and basically living here and working from Toronto. And as a result, I think I was more touched and engaged by what was happening in the Canadian political landscape than I ever had been. And so I'll stop there and let you ask questions. Obviously, I can go on, but that's setting the stage for what the We Charity scandal was. And I wrote this book largely because I felt like so much misinformation was in the public space. So few people, knew about it. That disconnect between who knew about it and who knows what really happened was so big, and I was trying to narrow it.
Yeah. And when you think of the people who were involved, which are Craig and Mark Kielburger, I think they are well-known figures within the Canadian educational system even. I remember in grade 10, I think all Ontario students at least, they participated in a project called YPI, or the Youth Project Initiative. And from my experience with that, and my friend Calvin here was in my civics class in grade 10, and he knows how intricately we picked these charities. We were so surprised that there were people like that, or an organization that was willing, at the time it was Free the Children, to kind of swoop in and give every student in Ontario the chance to research a charity, find out everything about it, and then make a rigorous pitch about how you could identify the strengths and weaknesses of that charity, and at the end they would donate $5,000 to that particular charity. So every student felt like they had their hand in some philanthropic giving. The issue, I think, coming out of this is their reputations were a bit tarnished as well, which to me, as an outsider looking at the news, I was surprised because I had met both of them during that program, and they were incredibly nice guys, and it seemed like everything they did was truly altruistic. And if you've ever gone to We Day, some of the younger members here would vouch for that as well. But you have you know them well, I'm assuming, like one-on-one, right?
Sure. I mean, I obviously know them very well. I have a long-standing relationship with them. I went to high school with Mark Kielburger. So I've known Craig Kielburger since they were young. And so, I'll say two things in response to that I think are interesting. One is, obviously we could talk about them a long time. Happy to have questions at the end. But, one is, I think the story of what happened with We Charity is in some ways inextricably linked with the Kielburger brothers as figures in Canadian society, because they had been darlings of Canadian society for a long time. Craig Kielburger had founded Free the Children when he was 12. There was a very powerful narrative and story around that. They had really been in schools, 7,000 schools in Canada. And I think in some ways they were both revered, but I think they were so wildly successful at what they did internationally. I mean, you have all these other charities that are scrounging for dollars, and somehow it seemed like We Charity was able to get political figures to visit its international projects. It seemed like someone would try and get, a guest speaker from a local charity. They would show up with the Dalai Lama, and there was a little bit of, I think both jealousy and Schadenfreude and everything there. And I'm very open in the book of how I think, you know, the Kielburgers are also architects of their own misfortune in certain ways. But I do think understanding what happened here sort of does require a little bit understanding why the public was so quick to turn on them and distrust them. And it's complicated, but I think it has to do with a lot of forces, like what a lot of people call tall poppy syndrome in Canada, which is this notion that I think Canadians, and I say this admittedly as a bit of an expat looking in, have a tendency not to really celebrate exceptionalism in business. Like when Canadians tend to talk about exceptionalism, they tend to talk about it as their, you know, our celebration of diversity or our celebration of our view on environmentalism or a celebration of all the ways in which we're not American. But if someone's wildly successful at business, that's not a cause to be celebrated. And what the Kielburgers did is they very much believed in a entrepreneurial, business-like model of charity. You know, they wanted to be like, you know, the Silicon Valley version of charity, and they brought that kind of energy to it. And that was very exciting when it worked, but easy to distrust when it didn't. Yeah. So that's one piece of the Kielburger, but if you bear with me, I would say one of the key points of my book is that Canadians needed to look past the Kielburgers. You know, the way I think about it is, like, if you think about York University, right? If you think about York University as a building, or let's say Osgoode, let's be more specific. If you think of Osgoode as a building, I guess it would be easy to criticize the building. And if you thought of Osgoode as even the dean of Osgoode, and you decided you want to criticize the dean of Osgoode, I mean, you could do that. And if you thought that was enough, and you could just say, but that's not Osgoode, right? Osgoode is the thousands of students who go there. Osgoode is the hundreds of thousands of lawyers who give back to their community every day, who've been educated there. And if you want to criticize Osgoode, but you're forced to talk about it that way, I think the vision changes. And I think what happened here is it was very easy for politicians and the media to say, we charity is awful. And you'd be like, okay, I can accept that. I don't really need to think about it too much. Where there's smoke, maybe there's fire. The Kielburger brothers, they're shady, right? And maybe you could accept that, and they have their foibles and flaws. But what the media and politicians never did is say, well, behind We Charity are 40,000 Canadian young people who volunteered in Africa and South America to better the world. Behind We Charity is 300,000 Ethiopian children going to school. Behind We Charity is 1 million Kenyan people who now basically have clean drinking water, schools, and women's empowerment centers. Behind We Charity is 20 years of people who have had mental health programming in 7,000 schools in our country. And what I felt was very painful is no one engaged with that. No one wanted to talk about it, which is what ultimately shaped the title of the book, What We Lost. Because I said, well, you can't really know what you've lost if you don't know what you've had. And I feel like that point was being missed. So, bit of a long answer, but I hope that helped address the question.
But I think it's true, because all of the media coverage on this never talked about what we lost, right? It was all about, you know, what the Trudeau government did terribly, you know, how this was used as political cannon fodder. So it's important, I think, that that's out there and that people know, like, how this has impacted not just our not-for-profit sector, but not-for-profit sectors across the globe.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. You know, one of the things I really felt, you know, when people always ask me, why did you write this book? And most of the time I talk to audiences who know a lot about the story already. So I don't spend a lot of time talking about the We Charity scandal and what it was and who it is. I try to really focus in on why did I write this book?
Yes.
And, you know, the first reason is obviously, I think, pretty apparent. I wanted to set the record straight. And I felt like there was too much misinformation in the public space, and it just upset me, and I felt like that it should be out there. But the second reason, and ultimately the one that became the most profound for me, was making unheard voices heard, giving space to those voices that I felt were left out in a way that just made no sense to me. I mean, how could you have, I mean, there were 25,000 articles written about the We Charity scandal. It was the second most covered news story after COVID in Canada in 2020. And literally none of them involved interviews with students or teachers. So you would say, how could a charity that for 25 years serviced students and teachers, young people and educators, how could you basically have coverage that talks about them, talks about We Charity and doesn't ask them how they feel? And yet those people are completely ignored. And then you had programming in places like the CBC, which is revered in Canada, which would do specials on what happened in Kenya from the perspective of a few rich Western donors. And they actually went to Kenya, did a whole show on it, and didn't talk to Kenyans. And you sort of thought, well, this is just sort of amazing the way voices are being left out, and it's very surprising and disturbing, and yet I don't read anything anywhere in the mainstream media or in social media that is noting that absence. And so that really motivated me. And then the third reason I wrote it, and I'll leave it to you to ask some questions about it and direct me where you want to talk about it, is really I just thought this whole scandal is so much bigger than We Charity.
Yeah.
It's really a cautionary tale about really powerful forces in our society that are really shaping things and that we need to be thinking about. And I fancy myself having coined the term. I'm not sure I did, but I really think it's emblematic of what I call the increasing Americanization of Canadian politics, which is this notion of, I think we all know what it means right away when I say it, which is south of the border. It's hyper-partisanship. It's, politics, party above principle. It's the politics of anything goes. And it's this idea that you can just keep saying it, and if you say it for long enough, whether it's true or false, it doesn't really matter. And that's, the political system south of the border, at least in many people's view. And I think most Canadians, myself included, have always fancied ourselves a little bit more rarefied, that our social compact is stronger, that we have a deeper faith in institutions, that we're not so polarized. And I really think the We Charity scandal is like an invitation for introspection among, Canadians about how their politics works and how our media works.
No, definitely. Switching gears, as and if you put your lawyer hat on now, myself being an antitrust lawyer, we sometimes get called in after, a price fixing scandal has happened, and we're just told, here, can you fix this? You had the opportunity to exercise some real crisis management because you were in the throes of the scandal as it was going on. Being a board member, I'm sure you were asked for legal advice and also how to navigate these waters. And so tell me a bit about how that felt and what kind of experiences you got from that.
Yeah, it was funny. I've told some people, including some people in this room who worked on aspects of the We Charity matters, that in some ways, my practice is really crisis management. That's what I do for a living. In some ways, yes, I'm a securities enforcement, but really it's helping companies and executives deal with crisis. And I always wished I was hired, to handle helping with the We Charity scandal, not just having to deal with it from the inside. But as a board member, for me, I was on the board since 2017, right through the end of the scandal. I only stepped down from the board so I could write this book and feel a little more independent in doing so and not having any governance obligations for the organization. But it was a really sobering time because as a lawyer, I'm a really skeptical person, and I don't trust easily, or trust but verify, and I really was nervous because I was reading it too, and my reaction was not, let's rally the troops, defend ourselves. I was like, have I drunk the Kool-Aid? Have I missed something? Am I part of something that is sinister or really problematic and not appreciating it? I mean, frankly, are the Kielburgers on the take? Legitimately concerned. I mean, especially with every article. And, I just felt like, on the one hand, if any of it was true, I just really couldn't continue to be associated with this or serve any longer. And they were not gonna get any kind of benefit from my presence. On the other hand, I wasn't gonna let something 25 years of hard work, and a lot of people who shed a lot of tears in front of me, go to waste because no one was prepared to unearth the truth. And so I did feel uniquely positioned as a lawyer who does internal investigations for a living, who follows the money, focuses on evidence, not rumors, not innuendo, but hard facts and evidence. I felt really well positioned to be the person who takes a look at it. Now, I'm an insider, so you know there's some discount that has to be offered, right? Because I wear my bias on my sleeve, and I think that's important to acknowledge. But I sort of put on my litigator's hat, really focused on, you know, what are the facts? What does the hard evidence show? As part of the book, and as part of my role as board member, I talk to every kind of professional you can. Forensic accountants, the kind of people I work with every day. I talk to, you know, accounting professionals, people who are, you know, experts in charity law. Really just read every piece of paper I could. And, you know, I think that was really important work to do. And I think the board, you know, I think it was a little burden because I was the only lawyer on the board. So I do think that the board often looked to me, and I don't say that it was an unwelcome burden. I was pleased to do it, but it was a lot because I think people would say, well, Tawfiq, what do you want to do about it? You know, how are we going to handle this? Well, this is the new allegation. What should we do? And so I was both overwhelmed by it at times, but also super gratified that I was, you know, at least in the room with the skill set to feel confident that we could, you know, navigate the waters.
And what was your reaction when you saw, like, members of parliament, like, you know, Pierre Poilievre or you know, members of both the Conservative and the NDP party just flinging the We Charity itself as something that's really politicized back and forth in the House of Commons?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was really, so again, I tend to bring a lawyer's eye to these things. So like I'm okay with bad witnesses. I'm okay with people who spin things. I'm used to that. And certainly if you live in the US, you're used to a congressional theater.
Yes.
Right? But I think this was the first time in my adult life where I watched respected public officials and very serious people in the media who I respected just traffic in outright lies. And I think that was really disturbing to me, where, you know, you'd see, you know, you mentioned Pierre Poilievre, and I have no political skin in the game because one of the things that's the strange achievement of my book is that it's highly critical of all political parties. It's very, very ferociously critical of the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Liberal government. And it's ferociously critical of the Globe and Mail and the National Post and the CBC. So I have no political skin in the game. But when you listen to people like Pierre Poilievre, who have used, in some ways, the profile enhancement that they gained through the We Charity scandal to achieve a leadership position in the country, and you look at people like Charlie Angus from the NDP, I think the two real chief, you know, protagonists or antagonists, depending on what side of the story, how you read the story. Honestly, you could just, my book, I point to like 20 different things that they said that are just factually, demonstrably false. And they don't say them once or twice, they say them hundreds of times. And it's, you know, like the number that's involved in the Canada Student Service Grant, forgive me, is $543 million. It's just a fact. There's no way you can rationally dispute it. And yet, you can just go online right now and find hundreds of tweets from them calling it a $900 million or $1 billion program. Yeah. And the reason they do it is because there was some piece of paper 3 years ago or 5 years ago that basically suggested that this could be a $900 million program, and they seized it because $1 billion program sounds good. Yep. And they just won't correct it. But more importantly, and the book will tell you this, the Globe and Mail was asked to correct it, and they sent back, I mean, I have the emails, right? So you can't believe what you're hearing. The editor of the Globe and Mail sending back saying, well, I'm not going to make the correction because I've Googled it. And 543 appears more often, 900 appears more often than 543. So therefore, we're just going with it, right? And you read it and you're like, it can't be that's what they're saying, but they are. And so, you know, I think that was the thing that troubled me the most, is I just couldn't believe what you'd read. And I don't know. I think most of us have some faith in the media still, where you sort of assume that what you're reading from really reputable mainstream media is going to be mostly true and the product of serious investigation. And what I came to realize is really investigative journalism is in incredibly short supply. And people who are deeply invested in a story in this day and age are prepared to get it out even if it's wrong. And it's tough to bear. I'm not sure I have the magic answers, but.
No, it just sounds better too when you can say, Mr. Speaker, $1 billion, and then you just repeat that over and over again.
You sound like Pierre Paul.
Yeah. He is, you know.
I didn't ask for your role model.
No comment, yeah. So, you know, a lot of us as lawyers, and a lot of us here are aspiring lawyers, often don't think about, you know, do I want to go into the corporate world? Do I want to like make the world a better place? That's usually what the intentions you have going into law or something of that. And then, as you mentioned before, you can sell out, as I obviously did.
I'm glad you put it on you.
Yeah, I did. But you know, as private citizens, as lawyers, you often feel the need to help. So, what do you think that, you know, as a whole society, you know, us as lawyers could have done better? Is it just simply a task of you know, making sure that when you're operating in this sphere that you're reading everything incredibly closely and making sure that there's no erroneous statements?
Yeah, well, so it's a great question. I wish I had like a brilliant answer. I don't, but I would say, you know, I think the message, not just for lawyers, but, you know, civic-minded people is, you know, I think one is to approach everything. I certainly now approach most stories that even seem compelling to me and obvious to me with a greater degree of skepticism. Now, I don't want that to go to an unhealthy level where you approach everything with such skepticism that everything becomes a conspiracy and everything becomes a lie. That's too much also. But I definitely don't just assume that because I saw it on a reputable TV program or because I read it in a newspaper, it must be accurate. And I think most importantly, what we can do is when we realize that people have not been honest, I think we really have to hold them accountable. I mean, people should, you know, pay a price politically or in terms of readership for misleading people. And I think that's what's going to deter people from, you know, taking liberties with the facts. Mm-hmm. And when you can take liberties with the facts and get away with it and become more powerful as a result, well then, you know, that just invites, I think let's just call a spade, I'm not being political, but that just invites the Trumpism that we all understand exists south of the border, right? Because if you can just lie about something for long enough and it becomes the new reality and no one holds you to account and you become more powerful, well, why wouldn't you do that? And everybody's gonna do that. So the only check on that is, you know, people who really care about civics in their country and discourse and fair play and honesty, really hold people accountable and ask questions. And so people always ask me, what can I do? I said, well, you know, one thing you could do is you could write, you know, you ask your member of parliament, have you read the book? What's your reaction? Or you could say, look, you know, I'd like you to read this and tell me why it's wrong. Or, you know, having read this, do you still support, you know, here's a piece of paper that shows you that it's $543 million. Do you still support and plan to vote for politicians who say it's $900 million to make a political point? And but that's the most trivial lie. Obviously, there's much deeper ones, but it's just a useful illustration. I think those are ways in which people could do things, and I think lawyers have, you know, perhaps the best skill set for, you know, using their talents to advocate and push back and hold people accountable.
Yeah, because unfortunately, the only one who bore the consequences was the We Charity, right? I think, well, maybe Ralph Goodale as well. But aside from the few maligned politicians, we lost a major player in our not-for-profit sector. And as you mentioned before, some politicians actually gained from this, right? So.
Yeah, well, you know, I shouldn't laugh because it's so sad, but it's sort of comic, and I talk about it in the epilogue. You're right. I mean, We Charity is the only party that lost. And again, don't talk about it as We Charity. That's easy. Children are the only people who lost. Impoverished Kenyans and Ecuadorians are the only people who lost. You know, teachers are the only people who lost. But yes, you know, under the umbrella of We Charity, that's who lost. And you know, the epilogue is really, I basically go in the book, go through where everybody landed, where all the characters landed. And it's like, you know, Pierre Poilievre is leader of the Conservative Party. Charlie Angus is, you know, more popular as a result. Justin Trudeau comes out of it getting the exact same result in an election. So he loses like nothing. Like it dents him not at all. And you sort of pause and you say, well, everybody came around. And then you look at all the journalists who are involved. One of them is Jesse Brown from Canada Land, who trafficked in outright lies and is very popular for doing so. All of the mainstream media hates Jesse Brown, okay? Like the CBC hates Jesse Brown. The Globe and Mail hates Jesse Brown. They can't stand him, they write against him. But you know what? On this, they all replayed him and all support each other and reinforced each other, unless you tell them that that's what they did, and they'll say, no, that's not what I did. But all those people, they got awards for their coverage of the We Charity scandal. People got journalism awards. People got, you know, press over it. I go through the list, and it just feels like everybody's career got better off the back of the We Charity scandal, unless you're impoverished in Kenya, unless you're a child in grade 10 who doesn't have as good a civics lesson, unless you're a nonprofit that's wondering why it's not as easy to get young people in our country to volunteer anymore.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for doing that research and like bringing this to light, because I think once all of us read the book, it's going to be clear, and you do a great job of allocating, you know, who carries the blame for what. I do have to say that after this, everyone will receive a copy of the book, and he will be signing them in the atrium. But before we get there, there's also like an audiobook too, right? Which is narrated by Martin Luther King Jr. the third.
Yes, Martin Luther King the third.
The third, sorry.
He doesn't get the junior third, but yes. That was one of the great honors in writing the book. You know, we were, you know, Dean, who's my publisher, will tell you, I learned a lot. I've never written a book before. Yeah. This was my, you know, my maiden voyage, and perhaps my only voyage. And I learned a lot. But one of the ways I learned is if you're an author without a name brand, you know, you want to talk to people who are influential and, you know, who invest in the story. And so I was super privileged to get lots of, you know, really prolific Canadians and people around the world to engage with the book, and two that were really important to me. One was Kim Campbell, who wrote the foreword to the book, as former prime minister, and you know, I thought she's very important. She was very important to me because as a politician, I think she's probably somewhat maligned or viewed as very unsuccessful. But I think later in life, she's an elder stateswoman of the country, and I think she has a huge, you know, perspective on the history of Canada, and she really helped me. And then Martin Luther King III, the eldest son of Martin Luther King Jr., who's really invested in his life carrying on his father's legacy. You know, especially this year, it's the 60th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech. So he's doing a lot around that. He was someone who cared a lot about We Charity. And he, you know, I'd met him, he supported We Charity. He really felt like it was doing something important in the world that he viewed as intrinsically connected to the fight against, you know, systemic discrimination and other really big forces. And so I was really honored because I had interviewed him, talked to him, and then I asked him whether he would read the audiobook, because I just thought it would be such a, you know, coup, candidly, amazing thing to have. And he was, you know, graciously went into the studio in Atlanta for weeks and read it. And, you know, we decided we liked it so much that, you know, it's available in podcast form on Spotify and Apple Books, and it's been great for getting the word out. So, because he's sort of synonymous with justice, and he, you know, if you listen to his speeches on the book or talks you can find on the website, you know, he says that this is injustice working. It's not, maybe it's not injustice of the, you know, the racial sensitivities that you see in the U.S. or the things you confront in the civil rights movement, but nonetheless, it's injustice because it's got a lot of innocent victims that are hidden from view. And so he's helped bring that out in a way that I think is really helpful.
Well, it's crazy that you were able to get him to do that, and also Kim Campbell, who wrote the foreword. It just shows like the amount of work both you and Dean and your publishing team had to go through to get this off the ground. Thinking about that now, would you ever write a part 2 or another book in general?
So there's a woman in the back of the room, my wife, Rippy, who I think will have a very, very strong view on what should happen there. But let's just probably not until retirement. Let's just it was I loved it. Everybody should do it if you have the opportunity. But I would say to do it well, you really have to care. You can't just want to write a book. And one of Tasha Carradin's here, one of my fellow authors under the Optimum brand, and she wrote a book that she really cares about the future of conservative politics in Canada. And I think to do it well, you have to care, you have to invest a huge amount of time. I don't really know right now whether there's a subject in me that calls for that, the way I feel like this was a bit of a once-in-a-lifetime passion, but never say never.
But there will be an updated second edition, because there's another chapter or two.
Sure. Yes. Dean has ambitions he hasn't shared with me yet.
Or still being written today. We'll call you back when Pierre is Prime Minister. So I think now's a good time to take any questions from the audience. We have Anisha, who is our SABA secretary here, who can hand you a microphone, or you might not need a microphone. And we also have questions from Zoom coming. Oh, we do need the microphone for the people on Zoom, yes. And I see Ina back there who has a question, so why don't we go to her? Okay, yeah, well, let's hear from Ina first. I think you need to give her the microphone, Anisha.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes,
Great.
perfect.
Hope everybody in the virtual world can do that too. Thank you, Dean Condon and OPD and SABA for hosting us. Devin, you did a fantastic job. One of my, I would say, all-out favorite fireside chats.
Oh.
Really loved it. Thank you.
I will pay you after.
Obviously, I will thank the author as well. And I'm going to try to do something maybe a little different. I actually have 3 questions. I'll let you pick.
Okay.
So
I'm going to take the easiest one.
You'll have to decide. But as every good lawyer, I have to start with a caveat. None of my questions represent the province of Ontario. We know in the world of social media, our attention span of issues is very brief, right? Like the wingspan of a hummingbird. Is there another iteration for We Charity? One question. Another question. I really loved your comments about tall poppy. I was feeling that the whole time. I've not read the book, but as much as I understand it, love you. Do you think this is a scandal outside of Canada? Had this happened elsewhere? And then another question is, have you spotted something that might be akin to performative allyship of journalism?
Interesting.
My name is Ina.
Hi, Ina. All of my answers are on behalf of the province of Ontario. No, you've given me no authority, but so it's interesting. I'm actually, your last question is interesting, performative allyship, but actually it ties into your second question. So let's talk about it for a second, because I think it's fascinating. And I don't cover it that much in the book because I don't know enough about it, and there's a lot to learn. You say performative allyship, and then you said in your second question, would this have happened elsewhere? Here's the thing that's weird. I do think that in politics, right, I sort of get why left and right joined forces to attack the Liberal Party. I understand why they made common cause there, because they want to bring down the government. I get it. But in terms of media, I do think there was a little bit of some unique bedfellows who you wouldn't have expected to get together, where you have basically, Jesse Brown, who I mentioned, combining forces with the CBC, combining forces with the Toronto Sun, the National Post, and the Globe and Mail, people who should be competitors, Reuters, Bloomberg, people who should be competitors, all essentially playing back each other's stories without much research. And essentially being willing to do that here because it was getting clicks and moving things forward. And so I do think there was a sense of, I don't know if it's performative, but do think there was a sense of allyship. And it was weird because while I was writing the book, I realized that politics, I was comparing to the US. I was saying it's the Americanization of Canadian politics. I'm not sure it's actually the Americanization of Canadian media. Canadian media was doing something kind of the opposite of what was happening in the US. So I don't think this story would have unfolded in the US the same way, and here's why. Because what you put on CNN, Fox News must oppose. And what you put on Fox News, CNN must say is evil, right? The same with MSNBC. So in some ways, you would never ever get like a story that doesn't have a counterpoint. And in Canada, what was really weird is this, is with the media, you had this really monolithic view of what was happening with We Charity, and just a real acceptance of a point of view without much resistance or division along political lines. So that's not a complete answer, but other than to say that I think your question's really good and interesting one, that people who are steeped in media and media criticism and in the academic world should think more about, because this is a bit of a case study for how journalists who are supposed to be competitors might engage in groupthink. Other question?
Awesome. We have a question from Oscar.
Yeah, hi, so everyone. So I'm Canadian. I live in the U.S., Tawfiq, as you know, and my full disclosure is that I only bought the book. I knew nothing about the We Charity scandal. I bought the book because you looked like you needed the money, so I figured I'd buy one of your books. And it came into my house, and it went on a pile of books that, these I have to get to, I have to read, and yours came up, and I read the book. It's an excellent book. It really was and for someone who knew nothing about the scandal at all going into the book, it read like a thriller novel, to be honest with you. Like it was exciting for me to read it.
We're going to put that on the back of the next version.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
But what struck me about the whole thing was, so I didn't know who the Kilburgs were. I didn't know what We Charity was. I didn't know any of that stuff. But as I was reading your book, the two brothers came across as very sympathetic characters to me. They were the ones, in addition to the children and the teachers and whatnot, they were the ones that I felt really suffered because their life work was being kind of questioned for reasons well beyond their control. And then, as I started to get through the book, you made a few references to some of these interviews that they did. And I was like, oh, you know what? I'm gonna go on to YouTube and I'm gonna, watch one of those videos. I think Oprah did one and whatnot. And what struck me was, honestly, it was like watching an interview with Superman and finding out that he's a cocaine addict. And that's why he was able to fly around the world so fast. They were so, look, I'm gonna be honest with you, but I was like, these guys are their own worst enemies. Like they just cannot present in a way that comes across in any way, shape, or form as sympathetic. Mm-hmm. So the thought that went through my head was, and maybe this is the question I'm gonna ask, I don't think you cover it in the book, but was there any effort to kind of like figure out if there was, and I get that the attacks were on them as individuals, but was there an effort to try to figure out like to either just make them more marketable or make them more kind of friendly, or see if someone else could step in and say, I'll take that question. Like if you were there answering the questions, I don't know, part of me feels like this whole thing might have turned out differently.
So I think we can all agree that if I was answering the questions, it would have turned out differently. Let's just go with that. Let's go with that as an accepted fact. And,
they'd be in jail right now. Is that
yeah, no. Look, but you're onto something, right? You're onto something, and I don't. Let me say it this way: when I think Mark and Craig Kilberger are. I spend the whole second chapter of the book focused on this topic, and in the writing process, I moved it to chapter 2 for that reason, because I started to feel like you could not really understand this story unless you understood those two people. And unless you understood them in their most sympathetic light, but also why it's easy to hate them and why it's easy to like dislike them or blame them. And I think there's a lot of things happening. So I'm just being very transparent in this room. I think one is They started the charity as cute children, and now they're like 40-year-old middle-aged white men, basically, saying that the world has wronged them while they're trying to save Africa. And in the middle of a time where I think no one's particularly sympathetic to protestations of middle-aged privileged white men. And so I do think if there were different people running that charity at a moment in time, I think they would have been more sympathetic. I think separately, they're who they are. I liken them in the book, I think most charitably, to Steve Jobs. But I also think you could compare them to Elon Musk. You could compare them to Mark Zuckerberg. They'd like that less, but they're not here, so I get to say it. Because when they're flying high, they're visionaries, but they're kind of also easily like people you might want to punch. And I do think that that's their character. And I have a lot of respect for them because they've never done anything that makes me distrust them. And I have visually seen how they have enabled other people to engage in transformative change, how they've made doing good doable for millions of people. I've seen it. I've traveled to the projects with Nadeem, who's sitting behind you, my son. It's made a difference. And so, but I don't think everyone sees that. And your point is it's a lawyer's nightmare, Oscar, right? I'm a litigator, and for any litigators in the room, the reality is, you spend all your time coaching witnesses. And there is such a thing as just a bad witness, which is just someone who inherently has trouble seeming authentic. And you sort of always train witnesses, look, it doesn't matter what you say. I don't really care what you say. I just care that you sound credible. And some people don't. And I do legitimately think that's part of the challenge here, is there is a little bit of an authenticity gap with them. Could it have changed things? I don't know. But I think it's a part of the story that you got to factor in.
Yeah. I think a part of it too is, as you mentioned previously, there is a hint of jealousy, and I think another part of how we're becoming more Americanized is we love to see people built up and then torn down, especially successful people, and then we love to see the comeback story like a few years later. But it's that process of going up and down that people really capitalize on. I think, Anisha, you mentioned a Zoom question.
Hello, yes. This is from Louis Chawson. I'm sorry if I pronounced the name.
Shasim, yeah.
Shasim.
Yeah.
Thank you for your chat today and writing the book. I've really enjoyed learning about We Charity and the people behind it. What would you say was the worst mistake made by We Charity, in brackets, other than attracting hatred, tall poppy syndrome? That's question number one. Was there no obligation on the part of the charity to address potential conflicts of interest in dealing with governments in Canada and around the world? How about the issuance of donation receipts for, in quote-unquote, services?
So I'll answer each question separately, and if I forget one of them,
I can repeat.
Perfect, you got it written down, so you're great. So look, I think very quickly, there's a lot of mistakes made by We Charity. And some of them, by the way, while I was on the board, and I take ownership of some of them, even whether I was consulted or not. I think I'm not going to go through all of them and do the deep explanation, but I think for those who want to read the book or want to reinvest in the story, I mean, there were responses that We Charity early on provided to questions that were too cute, and they weren't lies. They were just wrong, and I think they got recharacterized as lies, and I think it led to some people really believing that they were in bed with the Trudeau family in a way that they weren't, and I think the biggest example of that was there was a question of whether Margaret Trudeau, the mother of the Prime Minister, had ever been paid by We Charity, and the reality was, We Charity, the charitable organization, was never supposed to have paid Margaret Trudeau. But Margaret Trudeau, and there was a question of whether speakers on the We Day stage got paid by We Charity. And the answer was, speakers on the We stage don't get paid by We Charity. We Charity doesn't pay for speakers on the We stage, including super famous people from Martin Sheen, Prince Harry, whatever. But there are times where ancillary to those We Day events, people go on fundraising trips and do like 15 dinners or speaking events or meetings, and those people were paid, and at times, some of them. like all charities? And the answer should have been yes. Margaret Trudeau is paid for those events, and she totally should be. And I think that was totally legitimate. It made perfect sense. She helped raise millions of dollars to help charitable work. And yet, they answered that question no. And the reason they answered that question no is because Me to We, which was the social enterprise business partner, was supposed to pay all those speaking fees. And so the answer was truthful as intended. But what happened is Jesse Brown from Canada Land found a receipt for $7,000 that was actually paid by We Charity to Margaret Trudeau. And it turns out it was just a billing error in a huge organization, clerical billing error. She's paid hundreds of thousands of dollars over many years to be at speaking events, like lots of people, by Me to We, one time accidentally paid by We Charity in an invoice mix-up, okay? But it had calamitous effect for We Charity because it allowed everybody to say, oh my God, they lied. They've actually been paying the Prime Minister's mother. And so that was a good example of a mistake where I just think people were too much of an effort to try and be precise, you know, and what we should have just said is, yeah, of course, the business enterprise pays Margaret Trudeau speaking fees and we pay speakers. And I just think, again, there are examples like that where things could have been done differently in hindsight. Do I think it justifies what happened? Absolutely not. But it added fuel to the fire. And sorry, I've talked so long that I have forgotten the second question. What's the second question?
Was there no obligation on the part of the charity to address potential conflicts of interest in dealing with governments in Canada and around the world?
Okay, so so the National Post did me and the publisher the good service of printing a 2-page excerpt in the National Post from the book when it first got released last May. And this topic was the subject of that 2 pages. And then there's some of my favorite 2 pages in the book because it's a question, no offense to the person who asked it, but it's a question that drove me crazy as a lawyer and as a board member. People would always say this to me. They would say, well, I mean, you know, where did the charity fall down? You know, where was the board in monitoring conflicts of interest? Like, you know, you were working with the government. How did they not see the conflict of interest? And I sort of paused and I just, well, if someone had asked me at the time of the Canada Student Service Grant, and no one did, okay, do we need to be worried about the government's conflicts of interest? I would have said, no, that's ridiculous. How are you supposed to know what the government's conflict of interest are? Why would anybody do that? The government has to monitor its own conflicts of interest, just like everyone in business has to monitor their own conflicts of interest. The government has to navigate. The idea that any private entity doing business with the government should have to determine in advance whether cabinet in secret meetings had followed its own rules, should have called Justin Trudeau and Bill Morneau and said, by the way, did you guys recuse yourself from the cabinet decision to appoint We Charity as administrator? And someone said, we can't tell you that. And I would say, they shouldn't tell you that. It's none of your business. And I liken it in the book to imagine you're applying for a job. And someone says, every time you apply for a job, you need to ask the employer whether they've complied with all of the Ontario labor laws required as part of the hiring process. You would say, well, that's preposterous. Why, as a job applicant, would I do that? You know, when I applied to Osgoode as a student, I don't think I should say, by the way, Osgoode, I just want to make sure that in all your internal policies regarding admissions, you've complied with all your standards and any government inquiries made to universities, any commitments that York University has historically made over the last decade are being observed in full. I would just say, can I get in? I really want to get in. I want to go to school here. And so I make this speech and I put some levity behind it because I think it's such an easy question to ask, but no, like We Charity shouldn't have been doing any more. It should have done what I wanted it to do, which was put in the contract that the government was responsible for monitoring its conflict of interest, like any commercial contract where you say, you know, you are representing to me that you have the authority to make these representations. You are representing to me that you have all the necessary, you've taken all the necessary steps to do this. And so, anyways, I get animated about this. So it's a good question and one that I feel strongly about.
And the last one was, how about the issuance of donation receipts for quote-unquote services?
I'm not sure really what that's getting at. They should definitely be issuing donation receipts for services. I mean, I'm not sure I'm aware of an issue with that, but yes.
When we have the chat with their accountant, we'll get to the bottom of that. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, Curtin.
Thank you. Thank you, SABA, for this wonderful Fireside topic. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I have a two-part question, or two separate questions. Have you experienced any negative feedback from being a part of the board during...
Other than from Dean?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
But yeah, did you experience, if any, sort of negative feedback or negative comments from anybody, the public, media, as you were part of the board during turbulent times for We? And two, you made a comment during the Fireside that you almost wish you had been retained to deal with the We scandal. During the book writing process, were there any moments of reflection, any aha moments where you realized that this definitely should have been done differently? I'm sure you address it in the book, but would love to hear it from you first.
This should have been what? What's the last part of that?
That things should have been done differently, or this particular instance could have been dealt in a better way. As you made a comment that you almost wish you were retained to deal with the We scandal overall.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think, so I'm going to answer your second question first, and I'll take them in reverse order. So the second question is, would I have done things differently? So in two respects. One, as a board member, of course, in hindsight, I do think there are areas where I should have done things differently. Mostly in terms of, I think there are moments where I wish I had pushed back a little bit on the speed with which some things were done. There were reactions and responses that I feel like we left a little bit to the Kielburgers and others. They said, this is how we need to handle it. This is what our advisors are telling us. And I think my instinct now would have been to say, yeah, well, too bad, I don't support it. You need to take a day. But that's me as a board member. Then you're asking me, do I wish I would have done things differently, advising them? Sure, if I was hired not as a board member, but as a lawyer for We Charity, sure, there are witness prep moments that I would have done differently by 1,000. There are, if I was offered an opportunity to write all the responses to media inquiries, I would have done many of them differently. And sure, and you're right, a lot of those I didn't know in real time, but they came into focus for me as I was writing the book. But I was a board member and not the PR consultant, and not the lawyer. And then the second question, or your first question really, is, have I personally, had any negative feedback? It's interesting. I've not had much negative feedback or personal criticism. I've had a lot of incredulity from friends, not because of the book, because I think everybody's sort of kind of impressed that happened and that came together. But when I was on the board, sure, in the middle of the We Charity scandal, I remember I would be in WhatsApp chats with friends and people would be like, what did you say? Did you say you're on the board of this thing? And I think a lot of people were negative, but to be honest, and it's an invitation to everybody in this room, I actually wish there was more negative dialogue, because one of the things that I really hoped the book would do, which it has done a little bit, but I don't think it's done a lot, is invite a conversation. I sort of really welcomed an opportunity to speak in front of a hostile audience too, right? To say, here's my point of view, where do you disagree? And I'm very open-minded about people who say, I don't believe you, I don't understand this, or I wanted to be challenged. And I included 40 pages of, endnotes, not just because, I got trained to write bibliographies well in grade school or in law school, but just because I really wanted it to be a really well-documented, evidence-based account. But I was looking for criticism. And in fact, I was hoping to be invited, I'd have loved and still would love to be on, media appearances and shows where people said, I disagree with you here, let's have a debate about it. And, that's an opportunity I welcome. So no, I guess my point is I didn't get criticized enough.
Okay, well, thank you all for those questions. We have a cocktail reception that's going to take place in the atrium, as I mentioned, and we all have copies of the book for everyone. If you'd like a signed copy, Tawfiq will be sitting and signing copies. If you're attending via Zoom, we might have some extra books. If you email the SABA Gmail account, sabatoronto@gmail.com, we might be able to save one for you as well. Thank you to everyone on Zoom. Thank you to all of you here. Thank you to Dean Condon. Thank you to OsgoodePD. But most importantly, thank you to Tawfiq. Thank you for coming to Toronto. Thank you for taking an interest in Canadian, even though you're removed slightly, but thank you for taking an interest in Canadian charities, Canadian politics, and thank you for being an inspiration to all of us young, aspiring Brown lawyers who one day, hoped that we could be at the forefront of our industry, but also be accomplished authors. To juggle so many different balls at once, it's truly inspiring. So I appreciate that, and also thank you for not using a ghostwriter, because as all Torontonians have to do, because of Drake, we have to say that we write all our own stuff. So appreciate that.
All right.
But thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you then.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.